Welcome back to Tiny Blue Games. My name is, of course, Seesaw or Chris, and today we're talking about Guild Wars 2 in 2021. Today we are talking about the third beta for the End of Dragons expansion. The actual expansion itself comes out February 2022, so a little ways away. But in this most recent beta, we did get to see the 3 final elite specs that are coming with the expansion. So very exciting. We're checking out the Mechanist for the engineers, the Untamed for the ranger, and the Specter for the thieves. And it's going to be a very similar video to what we did in the second beta weekend, where we do a bit of PvE, generally some fractals, and then a little bit of PvP on each of the different specs, and kind of talk about what I like, what I don't like, and ultimately what I think they could have done better, what I think they could have gone with, or what I absolutely fell in love with. So there's a bit of a mix all around the board there. I should mention I am a Guild Wars 2 or ArenaNet partner. Does this mean I'll say nothing bad about the game? No, you'll hear me say the good, you'll hear me say the bad, you'll hear me say all of the in-between. What it does mean is that there are 2 sponsored links in the description below. One of them for if you would like to play the game for free and want to use that link, and one of them for if you want to buy the expansions and use that link. Using the links do help out the channel. But yeah, so check those out if you're interested. But with all that said, let's dive into the video. So the first spec we're going to be talking about is the Mechanist, and this is what the engineer gets. I think right away, this is probably the most visually pleasing of all of the new elite specs. We've now seen all of them revealed, and they each got kind of like a 30-second to 1-minute trailer. I think this is the trailer that I was most excited about. And it was interesting because it provided the least amount of information, essentially about, like a lot of the other trailers kind of gave a good idea of what the spec did. This one really was like, oh, hey, there's a mech. And I was like, okay. And I think I was really sold on that. Mostly because since the inception of Engineers way back at launch, I've always really wanted to use golems or machines and stuff like that. And yes, you can kind of use them on the baseline Engineer, but this is definitely a step in the right direction. We're making the mech or the robot here essentially a pet for the Engineer, and very distinctly, unlike Rangers, where you can choose different pets for different reasons, here you can adjust the robot, the mech, to fit different roles. And I think that's such a engineer aspect of this spec. So it definitely feels really good thematically, which is through and through one of the things I definitely look for the most when looking at these new elite specs. In terms of how I played it, I went for a condition build with a bit more tankiness to it. I think in terms of how it would get played at high-end competitive play, and I'm definitely not a theory crafter or anything like that, I think condition damage does work out well, just looking at a lot of the skills, but I could be completely wrong with how that plays out. We'll see. Obviously, there's also balancing that'll happen between now and launch, so it's really hard to make those judgment calls early on. But looking at the overall gameplay, we'll talk about PvE first and then PvP. I thought the mech was the hero. The weapon itself, so you got a one-handed mace, it feels good, but there's only so much it can do with 3 active abilities. The gap close was really nice. I think the number 3 is kind of like a rocket hand that puts some burn on and stuff like that. And then the main hand combo chain has a bit of condition damage and stuff too, I believe. But yeah, so it felt good. Like, it didn't feel bad. It just didn't feel overly exciting. Where the excitement comes is the mech abilities, and those are F1, F2, F3, and they can be customized through your different traits that you're taking. So there's a lot of customization here, and it does feel really impactful when you use these skills, which is always great. Not only does this skill actually feel powerful, but you get to see your mech do something. You're commanding it to, do like an aerial strike or something like that, and it looks really cool. Where this runs into trouble is, if your pet is off fighting something and then you want to be fighting a new target, there's sometimes quite the delay between that happening. Conversely, it does feel really good when you set your pet to attack a new target and you come over there just at the right time and you both start attacking it together. There's kind of that really good feeling, and that happens on the Ranger a lot. So it's nice that does happen here as well sometimes. But whenever you're dealing with pets, there is that risk that they aren't on the same wavelength of where you want them to be. So that's definitely a concern. In terms of the actual utility skills and the elite, I wouldn't say there was anything that was overly exciting. The most important thing, and this is kind of what we'll get into the PvP talk a bit here, is the fact that there is a teleport, which is really cool. And I think that's something very unique that engineers don't have access to. They have access to a lot of different ways to increase their speed and stuff like that, but to actually teleport somewhere is really nice. And I think it does feel really good in PvP. And it's definitely, for PvP, I'd say something you would consider bringing the entire elite spec for, just to have that teleport, because it is quite powerful in a lot of situations, and it certainly feels really good when using in combat. Talking more about the PvP, I didn't feel overly strong or overly weak. I think oftentimes PvP, that's emphasized by if your team wins or loses. I believe this game is pretty evenly matched, so that might be why I didn't feel overly strong or weak. Once again, it felt really nice when I had my pet attacking the target that I wanted and having the abilities actually land at the right time. There are times where it didn't feel as good. My pet would go chase off like some different enemy, and then I'd get attacked by someone else, and I wouldn't have my pet there. You feel very naked and very useless without the pet, without the mech. So anytime that happens, it doesn't feel great. Obviously, your mech can get killed as well. I believe the elite as well as the actual summoning ability makes it pretty easy to get the mech back into the action. So there's limited times where that happens, but when it does happen, you certainly feel it. So I think they made the mech the star of the show, and that's definitely what the spec needed. And because of that, I think it's good design. I think it's one of the more interesting and exciting elite specs, even if it doesn't end up being super useful in terms of balance, which we obviously don't know. So I'm going to give it a thumbs up for now, but we'll move on to the next elite spec. Okay, so the next elite spec we're going to talk about is the Untamed, which is the Ranger elite spec. And I'll say that this is probably the most disappointing reveal of all of the elite specs, just because of what I wanted for Ranger. And we're going to get into that in a second. I might even talk mostly about that. But so they get a hammer, and once again, it's very much about empowering either yourself or the pet itself. And we see this in a lot of the End of Dragon elite specs, is this kind of duality and the choice between the two of them. And I think that's great in this elite spec. I think the fact that they're putting that in a lot of the different specs is also really good, because it has this meaningful choice, and making the choice at the right time does feel very good. Now let's talk about some of the other stuff. So the hammer's cool. I love hammers, but I feel like all of the abilities felt pretty similar. They're all fairly slow, which makes sense with hammers, but they just didn't feel unique enough. I was often running the hammer and then the greatsword, and I had to really force myself to stay on the hammer as opposed to just using the greatsword, which has such unique, fun abilities. You know, the 3 where you go, swinging through the air with the owl, the number 5 with the nice little quick stun, and then the number 2, the maul with the bear, is such a good example of how fun the Ranger abilities can be, and I just don't feel like that was translated through the hammer. You obviously have the Untamed mode, which does power things up, but once again, I don't know if it, you glow different and stuff like that, but I don't know if there was enough visual impact for it to feel exciting on its own. So the big thing, though, and this is the issue I have with this whole spec, is I don't think Ranger needed this. I don't think there was an issue with Rangers being good in close combat. I don't think this adds anything that Rangers didn't have. They had a lot of abilities to fight close, be tanky. I don't know. What Rangers need, interestingly enough, is an elite spec that really focuses on sniping and long-range combat. Because your ability to play long-range with a longbow, it's not received love in a really long time. My ideal, and we're going to go down this path apparently, I don't know why I'm going to talk, it's going to be more about Seesaw's hypothetical Ranger elite spec, but my ideal for this would be a new elite spec that gives Ranger the rifle, and a lot of the different traits are all about, empowering your ability to shoot from range, right? With both the longbow and the rifle being the primary weapons that you'd probably want to use. And I know what you're thinking, that's an issue because of, how a lot of the buffs work in this game, where you kind of want to be with your team. Well, this is where it gets fancy. So as opposed to having your pet attack the creature, like the boss or anything like that, what you do is your pet now follows an ally, and essentially you make it so that the ranger gets any of the buffs or any of the heals that the pet would get. And because of that, the ranger can now go roaming around and doing all of this other stuff while still getting the benefit of being stacked. And I like balancing, there's probably a ton of issue with this. Maybe you'd have it so that they'd have to like check in with the pet every so often. I don't know. But I think that would be such a cool elite spec. It would focus on the ranged gameplay that I don't feel like I get as much of the ranger. And it would make it so that the pet's more of a support role as opposed to being something that is the focus and stuff. And I know it's not always the focus. Obviously, we've, absorbed its power and completely removed it from time to time, but I think that would be a very good direction for rangers that they don't really have right now. But let's continue talking about the final parts of the spec. There is the utility items. Once again, we do get a teleport of sort for the ranger. I believe it just goes to a close enemy, but I should read it over. It felt way less useful than the engineer one. Like in a direct comparison, I would choose the engineer one pretty much every time just because of how handy it felt. What I did like for the ranger was the kind of the entangling root effect that you can do. I thought it looked very visually impressive. It's synergized with a lot of different traits of the Untamed, and it was just fun to use. So I definitely enjoyed that one. The elite didn't feel great either. Like I once again don't know if it's just like visually it wasn't very impactful, but yeah. It didn't feel very good. So I think there's a bit of work to do there. I definitely think overall I'm just not going to be a huge fan of the Untamed. I don't think it's what Ranger needed, and it's certainly not going to be a reason that I'm going to hop on a Ranger for End of Dragons. And not, if you love the Untamed and like it's your favorite one, I'm not trying to rain on your parade. Just for me, this doesn't solve any issues that I had with the Ranger, and because of that, I don't think I'm super excited to jump on it. Which leads us to the final elite spec for End of Dragons, the Specter, which the Thieves get. This gives them the Scepter, which I think is really nice because it's very different for Thieves, right? Like we don't have magic weapons on Thieves in general, and this is a pretty big shift. So we'll get more into what the weapon actually does and how I enjoyed it, but I thought thematically giving them something that unique is very fun. There's a lot that I like about this, okay, so it's kind of a heal/damaging playstyle, and you have the choice between that duality, and we talk about that a lot with a lot of these different specs, is that there are those choices, and I think giving players more choices is great, but I do also think that the ability to have this choice really makes it difficult to enjoy the class right away. I think there's a lot of learning that has to happen, and certainly in the gameplay you'll witness here, I'm either primarily completely focused on damage or completely focused on healing. And I think the ideal for the spec, specifically in PvP probably, is having the ability to do both depending on the situation. So I think once you learn that and you know when you can apply both and how to do both very effectively, that's when the spec will feel the best. But let's talk about damage first. So in PvE and PvP, I played this as a condition build. I'm actually a huge fan of the condition Thief in general. That's what I used to play my Thief as. I've played it in raids like that. I've also played it in PvP. I know I'm pretty cheeky for doing that. And the benefits is that you stack a lot of conditions, but you also get to be immune a lot because you get a lot of immunity frames when you're doing, it's called Death Blossom, I think, as well as the actual just dodge rolls that drop caltrops and stuff like that. So there's a lot of different ways that you stack conditions while being pretty immune. So you kind of have some inherent tankiness to it. Now with both these builds, because I knew I was going to be able to heal others, I did put a bit of healing power and stuff like that, so that does give a bit more support that way, and it's not full tilt condition damage. So maybe if I went full tilt condition damage, it'd feel pretty good. With the Scepter, you get access to a lot of Torment, which you don't, like you get some Torment, but you get a lot more with it than you would in the baseline Condition Thief build. However, I'd say overall, just in terms of doing pure condition damage, there was nothing about these new, the new weapon, the new utilities and stuff like that I thought added or made it superior. Yes, the Torment was nice and stuff like that, but I often felt like, should I have just used more initiative to stack more bleeds? I don't know. So I wasn't completely sold on the damaging aspect of things. The actual utilities are pretty nice. A lot of them allow you to kind of do a very short teleport and drop down either like a damaging area or a healing area. So there's a lot of like support you could get just through that, which is great. The ultimate, I believe, is once again one of those areas, but I believe it drags people into the center. I don't know if like I never properly used it, but I never really felt as impactful. Like I often think back to the Mesmer's ability to have people float, and that one felt so impactful when you put it down. Now this is, I believe, only a minute-long cooldown for the Specter elite, so because of that, it probably can't be as strong as some of the others. Though I don't actually remember what the elite for the Mesmer is, but it just didn't feel as strong as some of the other ones, and that's obviously something that can be tuned, and maybe I just didn't use it properly, like maybe I didn't line it up or something like that. So there's a lot of reasons that might not have felt as powerful as it could have. Where this spec really stood out was when I tried healing. And I know I already stated the ideal is probably to do a bit of both. I tried just focusing on healing because I really wanted to see what you could do. And right away, it's super cool that the Scepter abilities do something different when you're targeting on to an enemy versus an ally. So I think that's super fun. I think the heals are really good. We did a fractal, like a low level fractal, so it's, you know, it's pretty easy to begin with, but just the amount of heals, like there was a few times where someone got really low and because of my heals, they didn't go down, which always feels rewarding. The fact that there's single target heals is really different also for the game. So there's some very interesting builds that come from there. And it makes me wonder if they're going to put more mechanics in the game that are focused on people, you know, single people receiving a lot of damage, because that's definitely something that the game has toyed with, but doesn't necessarily have the solution for. Like I think about the druid has kind of that, when they're in the druid form, one very single, like, I think it's number 3, where it's like a blast of heal in one spot that people sometimes use for single target healing, but there's no real answer to that. And I think it's kind of nice that there is a class now, or profession rather, that does have it. So that's cool. The other aspect is your Shroud. So essentially when you go into Shroud, you link with an ally and you're kind of funneling health towards them. I think this is very powerful and could be very useful, especially if you're kind of roaming with a friend in PvP and stuff like that. To be able to use this during high pressure situations, you could definitely support each other. And once again, in PvE, if there's more specific tank scenarios where you need to keep one person up, I think it could be very cool too. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here. I don't know. I still don't know if it's best to have it kind of be a hybrid character, or to go full tilt heals, or to go full tilt damage, but that's something people will learn as they learn more about the spec itself. But yeah, big fan overall. I think all 3 specs are interesting. I definitely think probably for me the winner is the Mechanist, just because of how cool the mech is, and the loser of these 3 would probably be the Untamed, just because I don't think Ranger needed this. But now that all of the 9 elite specs for End of Dragons are out, I'll probably do a follow-up video where I rank my favorite to least favorite of all of these specs and kind of talk about what I think I'm going to play on launch. Obviously there's a lot that can change between now and then, especially in terms of balancing, but I think my choice, at least for the story playthrough, will be about thematically who I think is the coolest, because, you know, a lot of the balancing will be more important once you start doing hard modes of the strikes and stuff like that. And the nice thing about the story is you can essentially play who you want to play. So I'm really excited to choose someone for that, and I'm excited to play through the story with a completely new feeling character. But yeah, hopefully you enjoyed this video. I'd love to hear your thoughts on these 3 elite specs. What did you love? What did you hate? But yeah, I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.